Remembers, most people think the Roman Empire fell in a single moment, a year, a date, a final emperor, as if history closed its eyes. Remembers, counted down and Rome simply stopped breathing. But that version of the story has always bothered me. Remembers, because when I look closely at Rome, I don't see an empire collapsing in flames. I see something far more unsettling. Remembers, I see an empire that kept living long after it should have realized it was already dying. And that thought is dangerous. Remembers, dangerous, because if Rome didn't know it was falling, how many others never do? Imagine waking up one morning inside the greatest civilization the world has ever known. Roads that stretch across continents. Remembers, laws that bind millions, armies that once shook the earth, temples, palaces, markets, cities layered on top of centuries of memory. Remembers, everything still stands, everything still functions, and yet something feels wrong, not broken, not destroyed. Remembers, just strained, like a body that has grown too large for its own heart. This is where Rome truly begins to fascinate me. Remembers, not at its peak, not at its glory, but at the moment when success itself becomes the problem. By the late 3rd century, the Roman Empire was everywhere: Britain, Gaul, Spain, North Africa, Egypt, Syria, Anatolia, the Balkans. Remembers, tens of millions of people, dozens of cultures, languages, gods, customs layered on top of one another like sediment. Rome ruled them all. And that was precisely the issue, because Rome had been built for a different scale of existence. Remembers, a city, then a republic, then an empire that conquered faster than it learned how to govern. What once thrived on shared tradition now depended on distance, bureaucracy, and force. Orders took months to arrive. Remembers, armies fought wars emperors would never see. Taxes were extracted from people who had never heard Latin spoken in their streets. Remembers, loyalty was no longer emotional, it was transactional. The empire still moved, but it was running out of breath. Remembers, what unsettles me most is that life went on anyway. Farmers planted crops, merchants argued over prices. Remember, children were born, old men told stories of better times, the Senate still debated, emperors still issued decrees. Remembers, from the inside, Rome didn't look like it was ending, it looked like it was adapting. And that is how most collapses actually happen. Remembers, not with panic, with normalization. Inflation crept in slowly, coin by coin, until money itself became suspect. Soldiers were paid less in value, more in promise. Emperors rose and fell with terrifying speed, many murdered by the very armies meant to protect them. Rome wasn't being invaded yet, it was being consumed by its own scale. And here's the question I keep returning to, remembers, the one I want you to hold with me as we move forward together. When does size stop being strength? Remembers, when does control become illusion? Because Rome had reached a point where no single person, no matter how capable, could truly rule it. Remembers, the empire was simply too vast, too complex, too fragmented. This is where Diocletian enters the story. But not as a hero, not as a visionary dreamer, but as a man who looked at the Roman world and refused to lie to himself. Remembers, he did not ask how Rome used to work, he asked how it could possibly continue. That distinction matters more than it seems. By the time Diocletian seized power in 284 CE, the empire had endured decades of chaos, civil wars, breakaway provinces, plagues, economic instability, borders that bent and cracked under constant pressure. Remembers, Rome didn't need inspiration, it needed structure. And Diocletian understood something that early emperors had avoided admitting out loud. Where the old Roman instincts were no longer enough, the republic was long dead. Remembers, the illusion of shared governance had collapsed centuries earlier, and now even the imperial model, one man the world, was failing. Remembers, so Diocletian did something radical. He divided power on purpose, not to weaken the empire but to save it. Remember, he created a system where one emperor ruled the east, another the west, both equal, both titled Augustus. Remembers, beneath them 2 junior rulers, Caesars, trained to govern and prepared to succeed. 4 rulers, 4 centers authority. Remembers, 4 imperial courts, the tetrarchy. At first glance, it looks like fragmentation, but it was the opposite. Remembers, it was an attempt to make Rome functional again. This wasn't about glory, it was about survival, and survival demands sacrifice. Remembers, Diocletian restructured the army, turning it into a permanent, professional force stationed where threats actually existed. As he reformed taxation with ruthless efficiency, he measured land, labor, production. People became entries in ledgers. Resources to be managed. Rome was becoming legible, but legibility comes at a cost. Farmers were tied to the land, workers to their professions, soldiers to their units. Mobility narrowed, freedom tightened. The state no longer trusted improvisation. Remembers, it trusted procedure. The empire stopped improvising, it began enforcing. Even the emperor himself changed. Diocletian stripped away the last traces of republican modesty. He surrounded the throne with ritual. Remembers, distance, sacred authority. Subjects prostrated themselves before him. He wore jeweled robes. Remembers, he called himself Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. This was not arrogance, it was strategy. In a world where loyalty was fractured, remembers, Diocletian tried to lift the emperor above politics entirely. If Rome could no longer be unified by tradition, remembers, perhaps it could be unified by reverence. But here is where the tension deepens, because the more rigid Rome became, remembers, the less it could bend. And when a system cannot bend, it breaks in unexpected places. One of those places, belief. As Christianity had spread quietly through the empire among slaves, merchants, women, soldiers, even officials. Remembers, it did not demand power, it demanded allegiance, allegiance not to the state but to a god beyond it. Remembers, to Diocletian this was rebellion, not theological rebellion, political rebellion. Christians refused to sacrifice to the emperor, refused to acknowledge his divine authority. In an empire now dependent on unity for survival, refusal was intolerable. Remembers, so the machinery of order turned inward, churches destroyed, scriptures burned, believers imprisoned, tortured, executed. Rome persecuted its own people in the name of cohesion. Remembers, and yet this is where history becomes painfully ironic. The harder the empire pressed, the more resilient belief became. Remembers, meaning cannot be erased by force, only hardened by it. Diocletian stabilized Rome, but he could not restore its soul. Remembers, and then, in one of the most astonishing acts in Roman history, he did the unthinkable. He walked away. Remember, in 305 CE, Diocletian voluntarily abdicated the throne. He retired to a palace by the sea, far from power. Remembers, far from politics. He trusted the system he had built to endure without him. It was a noble gesture. Remembers, and a naive one, because Rome had never been ruled by systems alone. The moment Diocletian stepped aside, remembers, ambition returned, rivals clashed, armies chose sides, the tetrarchy collapsed into civil war. Rome had order. But order was not enough. And this is where the story takes a turn that will reshape the world. Remembers, because out of that chaos emerged a man who understood what Diocletian did not fully grasp, that empires do not survive on discipline alone, they survive on belief, and his name was Constantine. Before we continue, let me pause here for a moment. Welcome to Empires Historical. If stories like this, stories about power, rise, decline, and the hidden mechanics of civilization speak to you, consider subscribing to the channel. It helps this space grow and gives us the freedom to keep exploring the past with depth, honesty, and curiosity. Remembers, because what comes next is not just about Rome, it's about how civilizations reinvent themselves when force is no longer enough. Remembers, and once Rome learns that lesson, nothing will ever be the same again. Remember, if Constantine would later teach Rome how to believe again, remembers, then Diocletian was the man who taught it how to stand still without falling apart. When Diocletian took control of the empire, Rome was no longer confused about its problems, it was exhausted by them. Remembers, decades of instability had carved deep grooves into the imperial mind. Emperors rose and fell so quickly that memory itself felt unreliable. Remembers, provinces learned to wait before pledging loyalty. Armies learned that their power did not come from Rome, members, but from whoever could pay them next. What Diocletian inherited was not a state on the brink of collapse, remembers, but a state that could not endure uncertainty any longer, and that distinction matters, because people often imagine reformers as idealists. Remembers, Diocletian was not one of them. He did not speak in the language of hope or destiny, he spoke in the language of limits. Remembers, he understood that Rome had reached a point where improvisation was dangerous, where flexibility invited fragmentation. Remembers, where delay meant death, so he chose something colder, he chose control. Remembers, what strikes me most about Diocletian is not how much power he took, but how deliberately he structured it. Remembers, this was not a man intoxicated by authority, it was a man terrified of chaos. The tachy was not a compromise. Remembers, it was a declaration. The empire would no longer pretend to be unified by sentiment, it would be unified by design. 4 rulers, 4 courts, 4 administrative centers. The empire divided not along cultural lines, but along logistical ones. Distance mattered more than tradition. Geography mattered more than memory. Remembers, this was Rome admitting quietly but definitively that it could no longer be ruled from a single heart. Remembers, and once that admission was made, everything else followed. The army was no longer treated as a temporary mobilization of citizens. Remembers, it became permanent, fixed, professional. Border troops were stationed where threats existed, not rotated through symbolic postings. Remembers, mobile field armies were created to respond quickly, not ceremonially. Rome stopped expanding, it started defending. Remembers, that shift alone tells us everything we need to know about the moment Diocletian ruled. An empire that stops expanding must justify its existence in other ways. Glory no longer comes from conquest. It comes from stability, and stability demands resources. Diocletian's tax reforms were relentless. Land was surveyed, populations counted, production measured. The empire needed predictability, and predictability required visibility. People were no longer simply subjects, they were units. Units of labor, units of taxation, units of obligation. Remembers, occupations became fixed. Sons inherited their father's trades not as tradition, but as requirement. Remembers, farmers were bound to land, workers bound to workshops, soldiers bound to service. Rome was freezing itself in place. Remembers, for a moment it worked. The borders held, the economy stabilized, inflation slowed, the endless cycle of cypers weakened. Remembers, but as I imagine living inside this system, I can escape a sense of narrowing space, a feeling that life itself was becoming more rigid, members more monitored, more predictable, and less alive. Rome had gained order, but it had lost elasticity. Remember, this is the hidden cost of Diocletian's genius. He built a system that could survive shock but not surprise. Remembers, a system that resisted collapse but also resisted change. And nowhere was this more evident than in how power was now presented. Remembers, Diocletian did something that earlier emperors had hesitated to do openly. He abandoned the last remnants of republican illusion. Remembers, the emperor was no longer the first among citizens. He was no longer a public servant elevated by tradition. Remembers, he became something entirely different, sacred, distant, unapproachable. The rituals surrounding the emirate grew elaborate. Remembers, access was restricted. Presence was mediated through layers of ceremony. Subjects prostrated themselves. Remembers, titles invoked divinity. The emperor was no longer part of society. He stood above it. Diocletian called himself Dominus Lord. Remembers, and eventually Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. This was not personal vanity, it was political insulation. In a world where argument had fractured authority, Diocletian sought to remove power from debate entirely. Remembers, you cannot negotiate with a god. You cannot challenge what is sacred. Obedience becomes ritual, not choice. Remembers, Rome did not simply change how it was governed, it changed how power felt, and yet, remembers, power that is elevated too far risks becoming disconnected from the very world it rules. As the emperor became more remote, remembers, the state became more intrusive, surveillance increased, enforcement hardened, punishment became example. Remembers, the empire could no longer afford ambiguity, and this is why Christianity became such a problem, not because of doctrine. Remembers, not because of theology, but because Christianity represented a form of loyalty that Diocletian could not regulate. Remembers, Roman religion had always been flexible, new gods were absorbed easily, worship was transactional. Remembers, sacrifice acknowledged order, not belief. You honored the gods because the state required it. Remembers, not because you were spiritually transformed by it. Christianity refused that logic, it demanded exclusive allegiance. Remembers, it rejected the divinity of the emperor, it denied the sacred foundation of the state itself, to a ruler trying desperately to impose unity. Remember, this was not dissent, it was defiance, and so Diocletian responded with force. The persecutions he unleashed were not emotional or chaotic. Remembers, they were systematic, administrative, designed. Churches were destroyed not in rage but by decree. Remembers, scriptures burned not in panic but in compliance. Believers arrested not as criminals but as destabilizing elements. Remember, this was the empire defending itself against an idea, and in doing so it revealed something profound. Remembers, the Roman state could regulate behavior, it could not regulate meaning. The more it punished Christians, the more visible they became. Martyrdom transformed suffering into testimony. Death became declaration. Remembers, belief adapted faster than bureaucracy. Diocletian had built the most controlled Roman state in history. Remembers, and still something escaped him. This is where my view of Diocletian becomes complicated. It is tempting to judge him harshly. Remembers, to see him as a tyrant obsessed with dominance, but that misses the deeper truth. Diocletian was not cruel because he enjoyed cruelty. Remembers, he was cruel because he believed Rome could not survive without it, and this is the tragedy of his reign. Remembers, he succeeded in saving the empire's structure, but only by hardening it against the very forces that would later give it new life. Remembers, when Diocletian finally stepped down in 305 CE, it was an act of astonishing confidence. He believed the system mattered more than the man. Remembers, that succession could be managed, that ambition could be contained. History proved otherwise. The tetrarchy unraveled almost immediately. Remembers, co-emperors became rivals, armies chose favorites, civil war returned. The empire had order, but order alone could not inspire loyalty. Remembers, and here is the quiet realization that follows me through this chapter of Rome's story. Diocletian taught the empire how to survive. Remembers, he did not teach it why survival mattered. He left behind a Rome that functioned, but did not believe in itself. Remembers, a Rome that could enforce obedience, but could not command devotion. Remembers, and into that vacuum, into that space between control and meaning stepped Constantine, a man who would not try make the empire more rigid, but would instead give it something to hold on to, something to believe in. And once belief enters power, Rome's story changes forever. As if Diocletian gave Rome structure, then Constantine arrived at the moment when structure alone was no longer enough. Remembers, by the time Constantine began his ascent, the empire was no longer unraveling, it was holding, borders were steadier. Remembers, administration functioned, taxes were collected, armies marched where they were told. From the outside, remembers, Diocletian's system appeared to be working. But from the inside, something essential was missing. Remembers, I imagine what it must have felt like to live in that Rome, a world where everything was regulated, remembers, measured and forced, where stability existed but warmth did not, where obedience was demanded, remembers, but belief was optional and increasingly rare. Rome had learned how to survive, it had not remembered how to inspire. Remembers, Constantine was born into this world of hardened order. He did not inherit chaos, he inherited a machine. Remembers, and unlike Diocletian, he understood that machines can function without loyalty, but empires cannot. Remembers, what fascinates me about Constantine is not the question people often ask, whether his faith was sincere or strategic. That question misses the deeper point. Constantine's true genius was not theological, it was psychological. Remembers, he understood something ancient and dangerous, that people will endure hardship for meaning long after they refuse to endure it for fear. Remembers, Constantine grew up watching power fracture. He saw emperors rise through force and fall through betrayal. Remembers, he learned early that legitimacy in Rome was fragile, and that authority without emotional grounding eventually collapses into violence. Remembers when civil war followed the breakdown of the Tetrarchy, Constantine did what many before him had done. Remembers he fought, but he fought with an awareness others lacked. He did not see victory as the end goal. He saw it as an opportunity to redefine why Rome obeyed at all. Remembers, the moment near the Milvian Bridge in 312 has been told and retold so many times that it risks becoming myth instead of insight. Remembers a vision, a cross of light, words written in the sky, "In this sign conquer." Remembers whether this happened exactly as described matters less than what Constantine did next. Remembers he acted as if belief itself could be weaponized not against enemies, but against fragmentation. Remembers by placing a Christian symbol on his soldiers' shields, Constantine made a radical claim. That victory no longer flowed from the old gods. Remembers from ritual sacrifice or from imperial tradition, but from alignment with a higher singular meaning. Remembers this was not just religious symbolism, it was narrative warfare. Rome had been losing its story for generations. Remembers, the Republic was gone, the Senate was hollow, emperors came and went too quickly to matter. What remained was power without explanation. Constantine offered explanation, and when he won, belief followed. I try to imagine the psychological impact of that victory. Remembers, soldiers who had marched under countless banners now marched under one that claimed universal truth. Remembers, citizens who had watched the gods of Rome multiply and fade were confronted with a faith that did not negotiate. Remembers, Christianity did not simply offer another deity, it offered certainty, and certainty is intoxicating in a world exhausted by ambiguity. The Edict of Milan in 313 is often described as an act of tolerance, but tolerance is too gentle a word. What Constantine did was shift the empire's moral center of gravity. Christianity moved from being persecuted to being protected. Remember, from marginalized to legitimized, from a faith of the shadows to a faith of possibility. Remembers, this did not make Rome a Christian empire overnight. Pagan rituals continued, temples remained open. Remembered, symbols persisted, but something irreversible had begun. Remembers, the state had aligned itself with a belief system that promised unity not through law, but through meaning. Remembers, and meaning travels faster than commands. Constantine understood that Rome's greatest weakness was no longer military. Remembers, it was existential. People no longer knew why Rome should endure, why its authority mattered, why obedience was worth the cost. Remembers, Christianity answered that question in a way the state never could. It offered belonging that transcended citizenship. Remembers, identity that transcended class, hope that transcended death, and Constantine did something even more daring. He moved the empire's heart. Rome, the city, was no longer suited to the empire's future. It was burdened by tradition, remembers, constrained by the Senate, and geographically distant from the economic and military realities of the age. Remember, so Constantine chose Byzantium, strategically placed between Europe and Asia, close to wealth, close to danger. Remembers, easily defended, free from the weight of republican memory. There he built Constantinople not as a replica of old Rome, but as its evolution. What strikes me about this decision is how little sentimentality it involved. Constantine was not abandoning Rome, he was redefining it. Rome was no longer a place, it was a system. Remembers, a faith-infused order that could relocate without losing legitimacy. This is a profound shift. Remembers, it means that power no longer depended on ancestral soil, it depended on coherence. Constantinople was filled with palaces, forums, and churches. Christian symbols were woven into the fabric of imperial authority. Bishops gained influence. Councils were convened to define doctrine. The emperor was no longer merely a ruler. He was a mediator between heaven and earth. Remembers, and here I pause not in judgment but in reflection, because this fusion of faith and power would shape not only Rome, remembers, but the entire future of Europe and beyond. It created a new model of authority, one that claimed more alongside political command. Remembers, this was not the end of Roman power, it was its transformation. Under Constantine, the empire gained something Diocletian never offered. Remember, reason to endure beyond fear, but transformation always comes with cost. By shifting the center eastward, remembers, Constantine accelerated an imbalance that would only grow. The eastern provinces flourished, administration tightened. Remembers, trade flowed. Constantinople became a fortress of wealth and order. The west, meanwhile, began to feel peripheral. Remembers, still Roman, still ruled, still defended, but no longer central. Constantine reunited the empire in name. In practice, he set the stage for divergence when he died in 37 baptized at the end of his life. Remembers, he left behind an empire that believed again but believed differently. The old gods would fade, the old rituals would disappear. Remembers, the Senate would recede into ceremony. Rome would no longer justify itself through conquest or tradition. Remembers, it would justify itself through divine purpose. This was Constantine's greatest achievement and his greatest gamble. It's because belief can unify, but it can also divide. Christianity would bind the empire together in ways law never could. But it would also create new boundaries between orthodoxy and heresy, between sacred and profane, and between those inside meaning and those outside it. Rome had traded flexibility for conviction. Remembers, and conviction reshapes everything it touches. As I step back from Constantine's reign, I am left with a quiet realization. Remembers, Diocletian saved the empire from immediate collapse. Constantine gave it a future. But that future would not like the past. Rome had reinvented itself once again, and in doing so, remembers, it set in motion a chain of consequences that would carry the empire forward in one direction and allow it to weaken in another. Remembers the East would endure, the West would struggle, and what followed would not be a sudden fall, but a long, remembers, uneven fading one that most people living through it would not recognize until it was already too late. Remembers that story is not about invasion, it is about absence, and that is where we must go next. Remembers, if Constantine gave Rome belief and direction, the western half of the empire was the place where that belief was tested by reality. Because while Constantinople was rising new walls, new churches, remembers, new confidence, the West was quietly losing something far harder to rebuild than cities or armies. It was losing relevance. Remembers, at first this loss was almost invisible. The laws were still issued in the emperor's name, coins still bore imperial images. Remembers, governors still spoke Latin and invoked Roman authority. To anyone looking only at symbols, Rome still ruled the West. But symbols can lie. Remembers, what I find haunting about the Western Empire in the 4th and 5th centuries is how normal everything must have seemed. Remembers, there was no single day when people woke up and realized they were living inside a failing system. Remembers, life continued, markets opened, courts convened, bishops preached, children were born who would never know a Rome that truly governed them. Remembers, the West did not collapse under attack, it thinned under neglect. As the empire's center of gravity moved east, resources followed. The eastern provinces were richer, more urbanized, easier to tax, easier to defend. Constantinople made sense as a capital. Ravenna, Milan, Trier, these were substitutes, not centers. As the West became a place to be managed, not invested in. And the first thing that weakens when attention fades is authority. Remember, in theory, the Western emperors ruled as fully as their Eastern counterparts. In practice, they depended almost entirely on military commanders to enforce policy. Civil authority shrank, military authority expanded. Remember, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the empire's logic inverted. The state no longer controlled the army. Remembers, the army controlled the state. This shift did not begin with barbarians storming gates, it began with recruitment. Remembers, for centuries, Rome had relied on its own population to fill the legions, but demographic decline, economic strain, and long service terms made that increasingly difficult. The solution was pragmatic. Remembers, recruit from beyond the frontier. These men were not outsiders in the way later history would portray them. Remembers, Goths, Franks, Vandals, Alans, many had traded with Rome for generations. Some admired Roman culture. Others sought stability. Many had already served in Roman units. Rome called them foederati, federated allies. Remembers, they were settled on Roman land. They fought under Roman banners. They were paid, supplied, remembers, and commanded, at least in theory, by Roman officers. It seemed like a solution. But solutions that rely on trust require something deeper than contracts. They require shared identity. And that was already eroding. The turning point came not with invasion but with desperation. In 376, remember, a massive group of Visigoths arrived at the Danube frontier. They were not enemies, they were refugees. Remembers, fleeing violence unleashed by the Huns, they begged Rome for asylum, protection, food, land. Rome allowed them to cross. Remembers, and then Rome failed them. Officials exploited them, starved them, sold them spoiled food at extortionate prices. Remembers, families were broken, dignity stripped away. The empire that claimed to bring order delivered humiliation instead. Within 2 years, rebellion erupted. Adrianople in 378, Roman forces met the Visigoths in battle. Emperor Valens led the army himself, confident in Roman superiority. What followed was one of the most devastating defeats in Roman history. Remembers, the army was annihilated, the emperor was killed. The battlefield was littered with bodies of men who once believed Rome was invincible. Remembers, I often stop here because Adrianople was not just a military disaster, it was a revelation. Remembers, it showed that Rome could no longer impose its will simply by showing up. The legions were no longer untouchable. The emperor was no longer protected by destiny. And perhaps most importantly, members, the empire could no longer control the consequences of its own policies. After Adrianople, the Visigoths were not expelled. Remembers, Rome could not expel them. Instead, they were absorbed deeper into the empire through fragile agreements. Remembers, they became a presence Rome could not remove and could not fully accept. They were led by Alaric, a man who understood Roman politics as well as any senator. He had served in Roman armies. He knew the language of titles and promises. Remember, he did not want to destroy Rome. He wanted legitimacy, land for his people, recognition for his authority. Remembers, a place within the imperial structure, and hesitation in a world built on power is often fatal. Promises were delayed, agreements broken. Alaric was treated as a problem to be postponed, not a leader to be engaged. Remember, so he marched. When Alaric stood before the gates of Rome in 410, the city was no longer the capital. Remembers, it had not been for years. The court resided in Ravenna, protected by marsh and distance. Rome was symbolically immense. Remembers, but strategically hollow. The gates opened. For 3 days the Visigoths moved through the city. They looted, they did not destroy. They respected churches. They spared much of the population, and yet the damage they did was irreversible. Remembers, they broke the illusion that Rome stood above history. News of the sack rippled across the Mediterranean. remembers. People asked questions they had never dared to ask before. If Rome could fall, what authority was real? Still, the empire did not end, and this is where the Western decline becomes almost unbearably subtle. Remembers, after fought and Rome continued, laws were issued, emperors ruled, administrators administered, to the people living through it. Remember, this may have felt like recovery, but power was draining away. Real authority belonged to generals now. Remembers, men who commanded armies that were loyal not to Rome, but to their pay and their leader. Many of these generals were of non-Roman origin. Remembers, raised within the empire but never fully embraced by it. One of them was Stilicho, a capable commander of Vandal descent. Remembers, he fought tirelessly to defend the West, negotiated when possible, and understood the fragile balance Rome needed to maintain. Remembers, and Rome executed him, court intrigue, suspicion, fear of his influence. Remembers, the state destroyed one of the last men capable of holding it together. After that, the pattern repeated. Remembers, the Vandals moved through Gaul into Spain and then crossed into North Africa. When they seized Carthage, the Western Empire lost its grain supply. Rome began to starve. The Franks settled permanently in Gaul. Remembers, the Visigoths established their own kingdom in Spain. These were no longer temporary accommodations. Remembers, they were new political realities. Then came the Huns. Under Attila, they swept across Europe like a storm. Cities burned, armies fled, fear spread faster than news. In 452 CE, Attila approached Rome itself. Remembers, a delegation led by Pope Leo met him outside the city. Whether diplomacy, disease, or superstition stayed his hand. Remembers, Attila back. Rome was spared, but sparing is not saving. By the middle of the 5th century, the Western Roman Empire existed mostly on paper. Emperors were installed and removed by military strongmen. Remembers, provinces obeyed local rulers. Imperial orders carried little weight beyond palace walls. And then, remembers, finally the end arrived, not with spectacle, but with resignation. In 476 CE, the Western emperor was a boy named Romulus Augustulus. Remembers, his name carried the weight of Rome's mythic past. His power carried none of its substance. Remembers, a Germanic command named Odoacer marched on Ravenna. He did not sack cities. He did not declare himself emperor. Remembers, he simply removed the boy from the throne. Then he sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople. There was no need, remembers, he said, for a Western emperor anymore. With that act, the Western Roman Empire ended. No final battle. Remember, last decree. No funeral for an idea that had shaped the world. The Senate still met. Roman law still lingered. Latin was still spoken. Churches still rang bells. But Rome, as a Western imperial power, was gone. Remembers, what strikes me most is how little this must have felt like an ending to the people living through it. Remembers, there was no moment of collective realization. No single shock. Just a slow awareness that the empire no longer answered when called. Remembers, and yet while the West faded, the East endured. Constantinople stood strong behind its walls. Wealth flowed through its markets. Remembers, administration functioned. The emperor ruled with confidence. Rome had not fallen everywhere. It had chosen where it would survive. Remembers, and that choice made quietly, gradually, without ceremony, would shape the next 1,000 years of history. Remembers, but survival itself would demand transformation. And that transformation is where Rome's story truly refuses to end. Remembers, while the West faded into memory, the East continued to breathe, and in that quiet persistence, Rome discovered that endings are rarely absolute. What survived in Constantinople was not a remnant clinging to the past, remembers, but a civilization learning how to live with loss. The Eastern Roman Empire did not mourn the West the way later historians would. It adapted, tightened its borders, restructured its armies, refined its diplomacy, remembers, and embraced a new identity that still carried the Roman name but no longer depended on Roman geography. This is the part of Rome's story that I find most humbling, because what endured was not brute strength, or not endless expansion, not nostalgia, but resilience shaped by restraint. The people of the Eastern Empire never called themselves Byzantine. Remembers, that word would come centuries later. Rome invented by outsiders trying to impose neat categories on a world that never experienced itself that way. Remembers, they called themselves Romans. Their emperor was the Roman emperor. Their laws were Roman law. Their state was Rome. Remembers, and yet everything about their daily life was different from the empire of Caesar or Augustus. Greek replaced Latin as the language of power. Christianity replaced the old gods completely. Theology mattered as much as law. Remembers, ritual mattered as much as command. The emperor was no longer just a ruler of territory, but a protector of faith. Remembers, the empire had changed not as it wanted to, but because survival demanded it. This was not an age of effortless dominance. Remembers, it was an age of negotiation with reality. The Eastern Empire faced pressures that would have destroyed a less adaptive state. Remembers, Persian rivals in the East, Germanic kingdoms in the West, economic shifts, plagues, religious disputes that threatened unity from within. Remembers, and still Constantinople stood. Its walls were not just stone, they were strategy, layered defenses, as natural geography and maritime access made the city one of the most defensible places on earth. Time and again, Roman enemies reached its gates, and time and again they failed. But endurance does not mean stagnation. Remembers, one emperor more than any other embodied the Eastern Empire's refusal to let Rome become merely a memory. As Justinian, when Justinian came to power in the 6th century, Remembers, the empire he ruled was smaller than the one Constantine had known, but it was more cohesive. Administration was tighter. Remembers, identity clearer. Purpose sharper. Justinian did not dream of survival alone, he dreamed of restoration. Remembers, what I find striking about Justinian is that his ambition was both visionary and reckless. He believed Rome could be whole again. Remembers, not symbolically, literally, he sent his generals, men like Belisarius, westward. North Africa was reclaimed for the Vandals. Remembers, Italy was wrestled back piece by piece. Rome itself was retaken. Ravenna fell for a brief moment. Remembers, it seemed as if history had reversed course. The Mediterranean once again felt Roman. But this reunion was fragile. Remembers, wars drained the treasury, cities were devastated repeatedly, plague swept through the empire, killing millions. Remembers, the costs of restoration outweighed its gains. Justinian's greatest legacy would not be territorial. Remembers, it would be intellectual. He ordered the codification of Roman law, the corpus juris civilis, a vast, organized body of legal thought that would outlive empires. Long after armies vanished, these laws would shape kingdoms, courts and concepts of justice across Europe, and while armies marched and borders shifted, remembers, Justinian rebuilt Hagia Sophia, a structure that still defies comprehension. Remembers, a space of light and geometry that seemed to declare that Rome's power no longer rested in conquest. Remembers, but in meaning. Even as the empire contracted again after Justinian's death, something essential had been preserved. The idea of Rome was no longer tied to expansion, it was tied to continuity. Remembers, the centuries that followed were not a straight line toward collapse, they were a long negotiation with limitation. Remembers, the empire lost territory to the rising armies of Islam in the 7th century, Syria, Egypt, North Africa, but it did not disappear. It adapted once more, reorganizing into themes, blending military and civil authority, conserving resources. Remembers, and learning how to survive as a regional power rather than a universal one. Constantinople remained the hinge of worlds. Remembers, trade flowed through it, ideas passed through it, diplomacy became as important as warfare, marriage alliances. Remembers, tribute, religious authority, these were weapons as real as swords. And through it all, the people believed they were still Roman. Remembers, that belief mattered. It mattered when the Seljuk Turks pressed into Anatolia. It mattered when crusaders passed through the empire as uneasy allies. And it mattered most when those allies became enemies. In 1204, during the Fourth Crusade, the unthinkable happened. Remembers, Western Christian armies, men who claimed to worship the same God, turned on Constantinople. They breached the walls. Remembers, they looted churches, they shattered icons, they melted gold and stole relics. For 3 days, the city that had stood against Persians, Arabs, and countless sieges was torn apart from within Christendom itself. This was not just a military disaster. It was a spiritual wound. The empire survived barely. Constantinople was eventually reclaimed. Emperors returned. Remembers, ritual resumed, but something had been broken that could not be repaired. Trust, confidence, the illusion of vulnerability. Remembers, from that point forward, the Eastern Empire lived on borrowed time. Still, what followed was not immediate collapse, but another long act of endurance, reduced territory, reduced resources, reduced population, yet the city remained. Remembers, when I imagine Constantinople in its final centuries, I don't see decadence. I see determination, scholars copying texts, priests debating theology, walls repaired again and again, citizens living among ruins that whispered of former greatness. Remembers, they knew the empire was no longer what it had been, but they did not stop being Roman, and then came the Ottomans. Remember, by the 15th century, Constantinople was surrounded. The empire had shrunk to the city itself and a handful of outposts. Remembers, the walls still stood, the spirit still burned, but numbers matter now. In 1453, remembers, Sultan Mehmed I brought cannons, machines that changed warfare forever. For 53 days the city resisted. Remember, soldiers, monks, citizens fought side by side. Prayers filled the streets. No miracle came. On May 29, the walls were breached. The last emperor, Constantine died fighting. His body was never found. Remembers, Hagia Sophia fell silent, then rose again under a different faith. Constantinople became Istanbul, and with that, remembers, the Roman Empire, an entity that had begun as a village by the Tiber, ended its final chapter. Or did it? Remembers, because when I step back from this entire story, I realize something that refuses to let go of me. Rome never truly vanished. It lived on in law, in language, in architecture, in the idea that power must justify itself through order. Remembers, it lived on in churches shaped like basilicas, in emperors who called themselves Caesars centuries later. Remembers, in calendars, in borders, in the very concept of empire itself. Rome fell as a state, but it survived as a pattern. Remembers, and patterns are far more dangerous and far more enduring than armies. This is why Rome still matters. Remembers, not because it conquered the world, but because it teaches us how civilizations adapt, harden, fracture. Remembers, and transform without realizing they are doing so. Rome did not die in a single moment. It lived, changed, remembers, endured, and then lived again in different forms. And perhaps the most unsettling lesson of all is this. Remembers, when Rome finally ended, most people living inside it had already learned how to live without it. That is how empires truly fall. Remembers, not with fire, but with memory. So when we step back from Rome's long story, what remains is not a single collapse, not a dramatic ending. Remembers, but a pattern quiet, gradual, and deeply human. Rome did not fall because it was invaded, it faded because, remembers, long before its walls were breached, the meaning of Rome had already thinned. For centuries, remembers, the empire learned how to survive crisis after crisis. It learned how to restore order, impose structure, manage chaos. Diocletian proved that an empire could be stabilized through control. Remembers, Constantine proved that it could be unified through belief. And the Eastern Roman Empire proved that it could endure through adaptation. Remembers, yet none of these answers solved the same problem in the same way. Rome continued to function even as its purpose weakened. Laws remained, institutions endured, rituals persisted, but fewer people felt truly bound to them. Remembers, authority became procedural rather than personal, loyalty became conditional rather than instinctive. Remembers, power was administered, not embodied. This is the most unsettling truth Rome leaves behind. Remembers, civilizations rarely collapse because they stop working, they collapse because they stop meaning something to the people living inside them. Whereas by the time the Western Empire formally ended in 4076, most Romans had already learned how to live without Rome's protection, remembrance, or presence. The empire did not disappear in fire, it became irrelevant. And irrelevance is far more final than destruction. Yet Rome's story is not only a warning, it is also a lesson in resilience. Remembers, the Eastern Empire survived for nearly 1,000 years after the West faded, not by clinging to what Rome had been, but by redefining what Rome was. It changed language, faith, administration, and identity. It accepted limits. Remembers, it adapted without pretending to be eternal. Rome endured not because it was powerful, but because it was willing to transform. And this brings the story uncomfortably close to us. Every civilization believes it will recognize its own decline. Remembers, Rome teaches us that most never do. From the inside, decay feels like adjustment, centralization feels efficiency. Remembers, the loss of freedom feels like security. Survival, stripped of purpose, can continue for generations without a feeling like an emergency. Rome did not fall in flames, it faded into habit, and perhaps the final lesson Rome offers is this. Remembers, a civilization does not need to be destroyed to be finished, it only needs to forget why it exists. Remember, if this story leaves you uneasy, that discomfort is the point. Rome still teaches, remembers, because its patterns repeat wherever systems outlive their meaning. So let me ask you one simple question. Remembers, do you believe civilizations fall mainly because of external threats, or because they slowly lose their internal sense of purpose? Remembers, I'd love for you to share your thoughts in the comments so everyone can learn from different perspectives. Remembers, and if you enjoy deep, reflective stories about power, belief, and the hidden mechanics of history, please consider subscribing to the channel. Remembers, your support gives us the motivation to keep exploring these questions because Rome's story may be over, but the lesson it leaves behind is not.